right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest installation of the Academia SG Junior Scholar Seminar Series. We're very happy today to have Loo Zihan and Natalie Oswin with us. Just let me introduce them very quickly, and then we can get down to business. So Loo Zihan, of course, is known as a theater practitioner in Singapore, an artist. But of course, he also has his current academic guise, if you will. So what he will be talking about is a critique of pragmatic resistance. And to do so, he looks at the documents in the United Nations Universal Periodic Review for Singapore in 2016. Incidentally, Singapore is due for a UPR again this May. So those of you who are interested in human rights issues, you might want to take a look at that. And Natalie Oswin is Associate Professor with the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. So her work looks at queer and post-colonial geographies, global urbanism, and geographic thought. She is the author of Global City Futures, Desire, and Development in Singapore. With the introduction out of the way, let me just quickly talk about the rules of the road. We'll begin with Zihan giving a brief presentation, and then we'll have Natalie discuss, and then we'll open to Q&A with some comments from Zihan and Natalie at the end. So that's how we'll go. Take it away, Zihan.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so I'll just begin. It's actually like my first professional debut as a non-artist, so I'm a little bit nervous. My presentation will be about 30 minutes. I've tried to keep it as short as possible, but there's a lot of ground to cover. If at any point in time I'm like breaking up or my connection is not getting through, just give me a signal and I'll okay. I would like to begin by thanking the conveners of this series of junior scholar seminars, the team at academia.sg, specifically Professor Cherian George and Corey, who have been helping out with the publicity and arrangements leading up to today, and Professor Ian Chong, who is the chair of today's session. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Professor Natalie Oswin for agreeing to be a respondent to this particular session. I would like to thank also my department at UC Berkeley for co-sponsoring the event. They have provided the resources and the space for me to be able to consider what I'm sharing today, and it would not have been possible without unwavering support from the faculty and fellow graduate students in Berkeley. The initial plan was for me to read a paper I wrote for a graduate seminar on Foucault that maps out the theoretical framework for my dissertation. But I've realized that perhaps it would be more productive, given the diversity of this transnational audience, to divide this presentation into two parts. The first section will provide contextual information for my research that might help indicate what I'm doing and where I'm going. The second section of the presentation will return to selections from the paper that is promised, that is relevant in conversation with the first part. So just a caveat, unlike the other presenters in this series who are much further along in their respective programs, I'm finishing up my second year of coursework in a 6-year program. So it's a really nascent version of my thesis that will continue to evolve in time to come. My research centers on gestures of survival and solidarity performed under duress. I'm considering these gestures in relation to the distribution of power in Singapore, which has been described as an illiberal democracy. My strategy of choosing Singapore as a site is one that not only transcends, but actively refuses this exceptional category of the nation state. I attempt to move beyond a liberal humanist concept of agency and resistance to consider how these gestures are shaped in response to power and the technologies of self. This provides us with a perspective on how gestures are distended over time and introduces us to an ethical mode of considering transgenerational solidarity under illiberal regimes. Okay, so let me unpack that. I'm doing my PhD in performance studies, so the first sentence clarifies my objects of study. I regard gestures to be a capacious category of animacies performed by not only human, but also more than human entities. Some of these entities include material archives and performance remains that decenter the place of the human or the fetish of liveness in performance. This interest in objects and archives is fueled by my artistic practice prior to commencing this PhD. Some questions I'm interested in answering include, can objects resist? And if so, what sort of resistance do they perform? How about subjects that have been deemed inhuman or commodities that are valued more than human? By training a critical lens on these more than human animacies, we are able to examine the porosity of the skin and disrupt the category of what we deem human or consider proper objects of study. This approach is inspired by scholarship on ferromethodologies by scholars like Mel Chen and speaks to the recent theorization of an objectless critique that follows in response to queer theory's subjectless critique. The duress that I'm referring in my statement is a condition of living and surviving within this nation state, and the impact of its authoritarian governmentality on marginalized segments of the population who have been deemed less important in the relentless drive towards a heteronormative reproductive future. This reproductive future, as highlighted by Professor Natalie Oswin, is one that focuses on the reproduction of labor power and the normative concept of a nuclear family. I place illiberal democracy under quotation marks to highlight the construction of this term against a liberal humanist conception of agency and selfhood. I align my scholarship with writers like Sabah Mahmood, Jasper Phua, Lisa Low, and Edouard Glissant, who are persuading us to reconfigure our underlying assumptions when we speak of concepts like independence or freedom, and propose a transnational framework of analysis that considers a poetics of relation in difference. Moving away from a liberal humanist conception of resistance is also a way of attending to gestures that might not be legible otherwise. These can be quieter, everyday actions that fly below the radar of pragmatic resistance or spectacular protests. Finally, I've also received feedback on my concentration on Singapore as a site for my dissertation from mentors who are a little bit worried about foreclosing job prospects because of the specificity of my project. But at this moment, however unpragmatic my decision may be, I'm stubbornly insisting on working with objects from, about, and in proximity to Singapore. I justify this decision by claiming that instead of widening my spatial breadth to consider the region or the world, I prefer to delve into temporal depth. By examining a Singapore, Malaya, Singapura, Temasek as a global assemblage, a contingent category that is associated with a mass of sand deposited by tides over time, reclaimed from the sea. Through an examination of this land and its borders as it shifts over a span of a century, we are able to consider the transnational consequences of this process of deposition and withdrawal, ebb and flow, claiming and ceding. Let me turn briefly to one of my objects of study to translate my statement in concrete terms. Last semester, I wrote a paper on Silam Pale's 2017 performance, 32 Years and Interrogation of a Mirror, a work that was executed in commemoration of Singapore's longest serving political detainee, Dr. Chia Tai Po. Pale started his performance at Hong Lim Park on 1st of October 2017 and walked to the National Gallery and then to the Parliament building. He held up a mirror and stood in solitude until he was arrested by the police. Pale was sentenced to 2 weeks of jail in lieu of a fine for, quote, conducting a procession without a permit. Most people will remember this image as a spectacular protest and regard this as representative of this performance. In my paper, I examine another gesture that Pale considers as part of his performance during his jail term. This consideration is clarified when he announced the conclusion of his performance when he was released from jail on 15th of October 2018. This gesture was performed while Paley is under the 6th day of his solitary confinement in jail. Paley was struggling to cope with his solitude and came up with inventive methods of negotiating with his wandering mind, which included consuming an orange that came with his prison meal sack by sack. The consumption of an orange as a meditative practice to mark time responds to Dr. Chia and other political detainees' interpellative tales across time. I view both Paley's spectacular protest and his quiet confinement as two forms of non-pragmatic resistance that occupies opposing end of the spectrum between hypervisibility and invisibility. These two gestures sit in productive tension with each other, performed in solitary and in solidarity with past political detainees. In The Politics of Piety, Sabah Mahmud critiques the post-structuralist feminist conception of selfhood and agency, asking us to imagine a non-liberal progressive subject that is different from the atomized subject in neoliberal capitalist societies shaped by the resistance to power. She highlights the difference between negative freedom, one that strives to be freed from external forces of restriction, versus positive freedom, one that focuses on self-mastery and offers up a way of thinking about performativity that moves beyond agency, conceptualized on the binary model of subordination and subversion. This is a concept of performativity that refuses the romanticization of resistance and foregrounds positive freedom, which Mahmud translates into an ethical care of the self. So if we were to read this notion of negative and positive freedom with Paley's gestures, one can argue that the first gesture of holding up a mirror in front of the Parliament House can be read as an example of negative freedom, where Paley exposes the restrictions and limitations a citizen body can perform in a public space in Singapore. Conversely, the moment of consumption of an orange can be mapped onto the notion of positive freedom, where one inhabits a state of self-transformation as a strategy to cope with illiberal restrictions on the human psyche. In brief, the central question I was posing was, when restrictions, legal restrictions imposed on the citizen body by the state in the form of a Public Order Act recognizes a one-person procession as illegal, how can we find different strategies of assembling and performing solidarity in solitude? What is the potential on focusing on ethical self-transformation as a performative gesture, and recognizing these gestures of resistance as a durational practice that moves beyond conventions of representation, spectacle, and event? So that was my paper last semester. I hope this brief detour is helpful in illustrating the position that I'm advancing in my own research statement. So the question I usually get is also, why Foucault, right? Between the lines of my research statement and the abstract for my presentation, you might have read that the theoretical anchor for my analysis of power, knowledge, and ethics is reliant on the Foucauldian framework. An important question will be to ask how relevant Foucault is to the Singapore context and whether he's the most appropriate source for the theorizing that I would like to perform. Perhaps an even more incisive line of questioning will be to interrogate my deference to Foucault amidst the call to move away from a liberal humanist school of thought or recent conversations around decolonizing the academy. I would like to clarify that the Foucault I'm engaging with leans towards his later writings. I differentiate this from the earlier and more commonly circulated theories of disciplinary power. I see this final arc commencing with the concluding chapter of History of Sexuality, Volume 1 in 1976, where he introduces a mode of governmentality that acts on populations instead of individuals, and thinking about biopolitical formations consisting of neoliberal subjects of interest. This extends to his Birth of Biopolitics lectures in 78 and 79, and is truncated with his unfortunate passing in 1984, when he was grappling with his imminent death and adopts an ethical framework of care. So in a way, I'm reading along the margins of Foucault and connecting various concepts that he was working on, but remain unresolved towards the end of his intellectual project. These gaps allow for a greater room for creative interpretation and are less totalizing. I'm also building upon other feminist and decolonial readings of Foucault by Spivak, Anne Stoller, Sabah Mahmud, and Jasper Poit. Most importantly, I find Foucault's theorizing of governmentality particularly effective in reflecting certain anxieties of the Singaporean government and its management of the population. We have had a history of being an incubator for various social experiments like the Graduate Mother Scheme in 1984 to create conditions for some lives to thrive and others not to survive. Finally, I'm also hoping to counter the centricity of Foucault with other critical approaches in queer theory and decolonial Marxism as I continue to develop my dissertation in the coming years. So with this, it's a long preamble, but that's the first half. I will move into the second half of my presentation, which focuses on the UN Universal Periodic Review mechanism and what we know as pragmatic resistance. As mentioned, I'll be reading selections from my essay that are relevant to give an indication of where my research is heading. Singapore is scheduled to have a third Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations on 12th of May 2021. The UPR was created by the United Nations Human Rights Council to review the human rights situation in its member states. Singapore has participated in the first two cycles since the inception of the UPR mechanism in 2008. As part of the UPR process, submissions are collected from non-governmental organization stakeholders and compiled into a report that is used in the working group discussion to support recommendations and monitor adherence to the UN rights framework. Given the scarcity of platforms where the discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity, also known as SOGI, which I will be referring to in short form, rights can be addressed at a ministerial level, NGOs in Singapore have tapped on this opportunity to pressure the government on a supranational platform to obtain a rights-based form of recognition. I regard this as a tactic of pragmatic resistance, an approach adopted by activists particular to the social-political circumstances of Singapore. This mode of pragmatic resistance was formulated by social scientist Lynette Chua from a fieldwork with queer activists in Singapore. My essay begins with a critique of pragmatic resistance through a brief review of documents from the 2016 UPR cycle. This includes joint submissions of recommendations from stakeholders, advanced questions tabled by member countries that call for a repeal of Section 377A, and a closing statement by the Singaporean representative that reiterates a need for a pragmatic and outcomes-based approach. Through analyzing the rhetoric of these documents, I highlight how the tactics of pragmatic resistance can be an extension of a Foucauldian form of governmentality and underscore how these texts, in response to SOGI rights, are part of what Foucault refers to as an incitement to discourse in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, so that sex desire can be effectively administered and regulated by the nation state. From this, I extend critiques that have been leveled at a universal rights-based approach to recognition of queer presence in post-colonial nation states as a biopolitical technology of power that functions as a normalizing instrument. I offer up an alternative approach to pragmatic resistance by way of refusal that foregrounds practices of freedom over processes of liberation. In the early 2010s, two books emerged detailing strategies of survival and resistance performed by the queer community in Singapore. Audrey Yue and June Zubilakapal, Queer, Singapore and Illiberal Citizenship and Mediated Cultures in 2012 is an edited volume of essays bifurcated into two parts, with the first section on queer citizenship and politics and the second section on queer media cultures. In the introduction, Audrey Yue introduces the notion of illiberal pragmatism, a condition that is, quote, characterized by the ambivalence between non-liberalism and neoliberalism, rationalism and irrationalism that governs the illegality of homosexuality in Singapore, end quote. She develops her concept from sociologist Chua Beng Huat's framing of pragmatic resistance in pragmatism in Singapore governance, which focuses on a centralized, rational public administration and acquiescence to the drive of global capitalism and accumulation. The second book, published in 2014, is social scientist and legal scholar Lynette Chua's monograph, Mobilizing Gay Singapore Rights and Resistance in an Authoritarian State. Chua focuses on the potential of resistance under illiberal pragmatic conditions around the formulation of pragmatic resistance, which she describes as, quote, shifting along a spectrum of covert, overt forms of action, and shows how activists innovate strategies and tactics to achieve change under authoritarian conditions, unquote. Chua's extensive survey of queer tactics of resistance is groundbreaking and informative for the queer Singaporean community, and has been cited as a conceptual model to understand civil society and activism in Singapore. However, there are several critiques that can be leveled at Chua scholarship on pragmatic resistance by reading it in tandem with this formulation of illiberal pragmatism. The scope of Chua's fieldwork was restricted to 100 or so interviewees who are comfortable with being identified. Even though most chose to do so anonymously as queer activists or movement leaders, this shifts the data set to a certain social class, as evident in the educational background of the respondents, with 93 of them having received at least university-level education. The time period she brackets for her study was limited to a 2-decade span from the 1990s to the late 2000s, which is a particular era of liberalization followed by restriction due to transitions in political leadership and the arrival of the internet. And the specificity of this political milieu within the larger arc of Singaporean history is mentioned but remains unexplored. A third critique can be leveled at the social scientific method of collecting data and designing research, which leaves little room for alternative approaches or contrarian voices to emerge. This means that queer resistance she maps out is the most dominant strand that is visible and survives, while foreclosing other possibilities of negotiating with an illiberal pragmatic regime that might adopt a Foucauldian, quote, radical approach that resists identification as queer mobilization. And I'm thinking of performance art or other forms of gestures that are quieter modes of resistance, or the notion of a queer presence that might not be legible. My intent is not to discredit Chua's amazing work, but gesture to the potential in the gaps of her scholarship and return to a philosophical and speculative refusal of certain ideological pragmatism that has been consistently reiterated in the political rhetoric about Singapore. So a Blockian form of concrete hope comes to mind, one taken up by performance studies scholar Jose Esteban Munoz, that opens up a critical gap of potentiality. In other words, I'm approaching pragmatic resistance along two vectors. Firstly, I'm inviting us to recalibrate this formulation of pragmatic resistance as particular to queer subjectivities in Singapore. A refusal of rights-based form of recognition that is contaminated by these games of power between queer NGOs, transnational activist organizations, United Nations as a regulatory body, and the anxieties of a post-colonial nation state. Secondly, I'm asking what are the possibilities of speculating on a non-pragmatic form of resistance that foregrounds introspective practices of freedom over externalized processes of liberation. The next section in this essay is a close read of documents from the Second Universal Periodic Review conducted in 2016. In summary, what is notable is how consistent Singapore's position with regards to human rights has been, and the constant reiteration by the state through its representatives, most recently by Ambassador Chan Heng-Chi, on a quote, "and pragmatic and outcomes-based approach towards the promoting and protecting of human rights of our citizens," unquote. In my essay, I compare Ambassador Chan's 2016 statement to the speech delivered by then Singapore Minister for Foreign Affairs Wong Kan Seng, titled "The Real World of Human Rights" at the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993. In spite of the 23-year gap, Singapore's rhetoric regarding human rights has remained remarkably consistent. In Wong's 1993 speech, he states that the, quote, "moralizing in the abstract is seldom productive, and a more pragmatic approach is in order if we want to be effective rather than just feel virtuous," unquote. Wong then goes on to reiterate this pragmatic approach multiple times throughout his speech, stating that, quote, "pragmatism and realism do not mean abdication," and emphasizing a need to strike a balance between the idea of universality and the reality of diversity. Significantly, Wong mentions issues of sexuality in his 1993 speech. He states, "Singaporeans and many people in other parts of the world do not agree, for instance, that pornography is an acceptable manifestation of free expression, or that homosexual relationships is a matter of lifestyle choice. Most of us will maintain that the right to marry is confined to those of opposite gender," unquote. It is notable that Wong defaults to issues of sexuality in order to make his point about cultural differences and a lack of an even and consistent interpretation of rights. We can read the consistent position that the Singaporean state has occupied in relation to SOGI rights from 1993 to 2016 as a milder form of state homophobia, theorized by political scientist Michael J. Bosia, one where queer identities are framed as the bogeyman or representations of the threat of Western liberalization eroding national morality. In such a situation, sexual minorities, according to Bosia, are taught, quote, not only to respond in the state's terms, and unquote, an example which is this controlled supranational UPR mechanism, quote, but also to think through them as well, unquote. In the case of Singapore, these terms will be that of vulgar pragmatism. It is also clear that perhaps due to the increased attention on SOGI rights and activism on the part of transnational queer activists in Singaporean queer NGOs, there has been a significant increase in the number of mentions and questions posed by other countries in joint submission reports and working group reports. Most of these recommendations by queer activists pertain to first and second generation rights, the rights to civil and political rights, but also social, economic, and cultural rights to education and healthcare, example. So this is an excerpt. There's a lot, it's a whole document that's available on the UN website that you can read in detail from the 2016 UPR. Through adhering to the script of pragmatism that is written by the state, these NGOs reproduce the ideal Singaporean citizen in their submission, one that subscribes to the logic of, quote, the exclusionary politics of reproductive futurism, unquote, that Professor Oswin speaks of, contending for an extension of human capabilities to the right to work, marry, start a family, participate in public sphere, take care of their health, receive an education, and so on. Political theorist Rahul Rao refers to this as the recognition of a homo-capitalist subject, where the civilizationalist logic of homo nationalism is supplemented with the logic of the political economy of global capital, pressuring the queer subject to walk the tightrope to claim both the liberalism of their universal SOGI rights and the illiberalism of their Singaporean citizenship. As Peng Chia pointed out in his critique of the human rights framework, even if we do obtain these SOGI rights, they would be, quote, violent gifts that stabilize and produce the identities of their claimants, unquote. So the question remains, how does one take a leap of faith to walk off this tightrope between the political double bind of non-recognition and misrecognition, between the rational and the irrational, the neoliberal and the illiberal, the universal and the particular? The final section of my essay is a return to Foucault, and I triangulate these three concepts from various stages of his scholarship in order to locate a line of flight that allows us to move beyond the regurgitation of the pragmatic script, namely Foucault's emphasis on bodies and pleasures as opposed to sex desire in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, practices of freedom over processes of liberation that echoes Mahmoud's notion of positive and negative freedom mentioned earlier, and finally, the notion of counter-conduct in his lectures on pastoral care that introduces an electrical motif to the notion of resistance, the notion of letting power flow through you and flow through the circuit and mediating the degree of which you allow power to flow through you instead of disrupting the electrical supply. The metaphor for counter-conduct that comes to mind for me is one of a light bulb, whose filament is of a material with a different resistance and instead produces heat and light while still conducting power. So by way of concluding today's presentation, instead of belaboring these citations theoretically, I'm going to share some current research that I'm developing and objects that I'm working with that might help provide some examples of what I consider as non-pragmatic forms of resistance on a quieter, durational register before opening up to comments and questions from the respondents in the floor. So I created this chart for easy visual reference. As you can see, there are two axes, one on the scale of pragmatism and the other on the range of visibility. On this chart, pragmatic resistance would be like, pragmatic and highly visible resistance would be events like the annual Pink Dot Pride Rally that is permitted by the state, which takes place within Hong Lim Park, a designated space for protest in Singapore. Non-pragmatic and spectacular forms of queer resistance in recent memory would include activists protesting against transphobia in the education system, holding up placards and protesting outside the Ministry of Education headquarters on January 26, 2021. If we go further back in time, I will also argue that queer events like indignation or Paddy Chew's monologue on his experience as the first person to come out publicly in Singapore as living with HIV in 1999 will all be considered to varying degrees a form of visible non-pragmatic resistance. But beyond this, I'm also interested in giving attention and thinking about less spectacular forms of non-pragmatic resistance, etiolated and obdurate performances of delinquency that are tactically camouflaged, like the persistence of cruising activities in public parks or innocuous-looking artworks that are repositories for multiple layers of interpretation. A work that has been taking up my mind space is Jason Wee's 2011 work, Lord Mountbatten Thinks of Pink. This is a photographic diptych that was commissioned as part of the Land Transport Authority's public art in the mass rapid transit system. You know, there are one in every station. This artwork is installed on opposite walls at Mountbatten Station. Incidentally, Mountbatten Station is also the closest train station to Fort Road, a public park frequented by gay men in the 90s for cruising. The official artwork description is as follows, and it's quite a mouthful, but I believe it's so cleverly worded that I should read it in its entirety. Quote, Lord Louis Dickey Mountbatten, friend to Noah Coward, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Lee Kuan Yew, once thought it was a good idea to paint a fleet of ships pink in the wartime. In 1940, he invented Mountbatten Pink as a naval camouflage color for the 5th Flotilla. The naval commander reasoned that the pink pigments would match the color of the sky at dawn and dusk, making the ships harder to see by the enemy. Using these unusual connections as inspiration, the artwork depicts a modern container ship at those pink hours, a vessel typical of those moored off the Fort Road shoreline close to the station. This station and Mountbatten Road beside it is eponymously named after him, the colorful last viceroy of India, unquote. So when I look at this artwork, I think about queer presence hidden in plain sight and the hundreds of daily commuters that walk past this artwork without awareness or acknowledgement of the cheeky campiness of this seemingly ordinary and ornamental work. So will this potentially be a strategy to engage with the quieter registers of non-pragmatic resistance that speaks across time to generations of queer individuals in solitary solidarity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zihan. Nicely on time. Let me turn things over to Natalie.
All right, there we go. Thank you so much, Zihan. So thank you so much for inviting me to be the respondent in this session. Thank you to the organizers, to those who were behind Academia SG, which is just a fabulous resource. I'm just really thrilled to be here from Toronto at 10:34 p.m. It's lovely to be here. So let me, first I want to say, I think this is that you said that you're only in your second year of your coursework and these are nascent ideas. And I think they're incredibly sophisticated and it's a real pleasure to engage with your work. And particularly, the idea, just the title of the work, Refusing Pragmatic Resistance. You mentioned in the paper and to me previously that there's connections for you between the work that I've done and your work. And I'm really heartened to see some of these themes being picked up in these ways, because just to give a bit of context for my own work on Singapore. So I'm now in Toronto and I've lived here for a while. I lived and worked in Singapore from 2002 to 2008. So it was right in that period that you're talking about when you talk about Lynette Chua's work on mobilizing gay Singapore, right exactly in that period where there was all this movement around the quote, the gay debates and moves to like tolerate and but not to change anything in terms of legislation, right, really, but to tolerate and to make that shift for the new creative economy. So my own book sort of takes off from that and says, well, instead of really belaboring will rights happen for LGBT people in Singapore, and I do hope they will, because there are material and profoundly important material benefits to rights in the kind of polity that Singapore is, right, and in all polities. But in the book I say, well, I do kind of what you're doing in a sense, is saying, is that sufficient? What kind of politics does that enable? And as you point out, and you do it in such sophisticated ways by engaging the works of Jesper Poir and Saba Mahmood and many other theorists, talking about, really a critique of liberal humanist frameworks and how we get beyond it. And I like the way in my own book, I talk about subjectless critique, and actually building on the work of Eng and Poir and many other people that you cite, but you're building, interestingly, in this paper on this new work that's coming out of objectless critique, which is fascinating. And it's great. I mean, that special issue that you cite is really extraordinary, of Social Text that just came out at the end of 2020. So I think there's something really brilliant here in thinking about, as you say, focusing on gestures of survival and solidarity under duress. So that I think that moves us away from that sort of liberal humanist framework, because in that framework, we move from sort of exclusion to inclusion, but the duress doesn't go away, right? That sort of atmospheric duress of the poly doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of shifts who is in and who is out. And as you talk about in Foucauldian terms, who survives and who does not survive and who thrives. And we get that there's that calculation being made all the time in all kinds of ways, in Singapore as in all other polities, right? And so one thing, so I'm not a performance studies scholar. I'm a geographer who has an interest in sort of doing mostly archival work. That's sort of my thing. So performance studies is not really a thing, but I was really captured by the, especially seeing the video on screen, because I just read it in the paper. I didn't see the video that you put up of the orange, and that performance of 32 years, an interrogation of a mirror, and the eating the orange as a meditative practice to mark time. And what struck me there was you talked about he's responding to the political detainees' interpolative hails across time. And so I just want to pull away a little bit from, I don't know what texts or what performances you will end up engaging with, but it seems that you will. And again, I'm not a performance studies scholar, but one thing, the things that it made me think about are this interpolative hailing across time, in terms of what kind of life worlds can be mined from Singapore's history. And that's something that I was intrigued by in my book, but didn't really get to explore fully. Because in my book, I talked about, the putting into place, or the ways that heteronormativity actually literally came to take place in Singapore. And that's part of my own project, was to look archivally and say this, response to the failure to, or the refusal by the state to repeal 377 was, but this is out of time, right? Like 377A shouldn't be in the Singapore state. But in fact, it is very much in time, because, post-colonial nation states, they experienced liberation, but without freedom. And we see that in so many post-colonial nation states, right? Liberation without freedom. So there's this, what happened, what I trace in the book is the way that I don't go back and say, okay, well, how do we find this sort of gay past in Singapore? How can we resurrect that? Really, instead, I say, look at the founding of heteronormality in Singapore, and that as a colonial practice, right? The fact that from the 1910s to the 1950s, there was an extraordinary colonial administration effort to do things like create Department of Social Welfare, to intervene in family planning, to really focus on those sort of administrative aspects, to turn Singapore away from being a entrepot of migrant workers to a settled nation of families. And then I look in the book at how from the 60s on, the post-colonial government really takes that and runs with it, right? And there's this notion of upgrading the family that was used in government parlance at that time, and wealth of social policy and social work and sociological work, et cetera, that's fueled by the state in Singapore. So those are the kinds of paths I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about these interpolative hailings across time. So I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in and thinking about the orange, thinking about the just sort of creation of desire in so many forms, like the way that desire is limited in so many ways, and doing what you're trying to do, which is pull away from the sort of identity-based, identitarian, very liberal politics that has a sort of essential LGBT subject, and to say, well, actually, what else is, what desires, what presences are disallowed in this conjuncture. So that's that's a lot of the things that made me think about it. I was just thinking about all the ways in which this alternative approach to pragmatic resistance is something that you are grasping towards. And I really look forward to seeing how that turns out, right? Like, what life worlds can you imagine into being that go beyond this sort of just, are we in or are we out in terms of rights-based things? Like what can we do beyond that? And so I look forward to seeing where you're going to go with that. I'm really intrigued to hear you talk maybe a little bit more about what kind of texts you think you're going to be looking at and how you're going to dig in to some of these bigger topics. Anyways, those are just some thoughts. Are really provocative. Really interested to see where you go with this work.
Thank you. Thank you. And as I've mentioned in the talk, in my script several times, the work is really not possible without the work that you have done and written about. It's from reading a book, and it's also engaging with the modeling of a way to think about queer theory in North America and suturing it with a post-colonial kind of Singaporean context. That's really inspiring for me.
Actually, can I just say on that, can I just say one more thing? Because you talked about being cautioned that Singapore is too particular, Singapore is exceptional, da 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 da. And I like your impulse to say no, it's not, right? Because in many ways, I mean, Singapore, as in terms of bringing quote North American queer theory to Singapore and thinking about it in place in Singapore. Singapore is a leading global city. I mean, many of the things that we see happening in Singapore, right, are things that Singapore does incredibly well. It leads the pack because it's not by any means exceptional, but it's because it is the norm and it sets norms. And so I do think that there's much to be gained from really digging in and thinking specifically about Singapore and saying, no, it's not an outlier.
Yeah, and as to your second part of the question on what other objects and
texts.
Sorry,
I'm just going to interject for a moment because we have a lot of people who are very interested in getting in the conversation. So Tan-Teck Heng has a question. In Jason Wee's work, Lord Mountbatten Thinks of Pink, thousands of commuters will probably walk past this piece every day without a sense of its queer subversiveness. But isn't this form of resistance even more covert and defanged as compared to the model of pragmatic resistance? If one is committed to refusing pragmatic resistance and finding more engaged and overt models of resistance mobilization, how does Wee's work offer a paradigm for that? It seems to be a step back into covert resistance, even as the work itself is fabulous. Now, just let me collect it through because I'm cognizant of time. Timothy Lowe asked if you can explain a little bit by what you mean by non-pragmatic in your formulation. And so let's start with those, and then we can move on from there.
So Teck Heng's question is an excellent question, and it's something that I've been struggling to pass out. And I think it's very important to pass out the difference between visibility and pragmatism. So something can be invisible, yet still be a pragmatic gesture of resistance. Something can be hyper visible and a non-pragmatic gesture of resistance. So I think in the question itself, there's a conflation of these two, especially particularly thinking and the default mode of thinking about resistance as always something that is spectacular, engaged, overt models, aggression. Where does this default model of thinking about resistance come from? Why does protest have to be the spectacular protest of martyrdom, standing in front of a crowd and exposing one's vulnerable self? So I'm asking us to really reconsider by reconfiguring what we think about and consider as resistance. How can we practice resistance differently? And the thing about Jason's work is that it's a subterfuge, it's a camouflage. It's camouflage in its text and its content, but it's also camouflage in its environment and its form. And what I'm interested in is that it sends, like what Natalie was mentioning, it sends a hail across time to people who might encounter it decades from now. And it also is linked to the past of Fort Road, of the history of the space, of Mountbatten himself, who has recently come back into popular culture because of The Crown. And it's things like that. So it's thinking about resistance in a different mode, a different form. And yes, you might read it in a way as perhaps something that is covert or necessarily suppressed, but if you reconfigure your relationship with resistance, how can we engage differently with these gestures and presence? Yeah, I hope that answers your questions. And I think that also speaks to Timothy's question on what is non-pragmatic. Basically, the pragmatism I have in mind is very much a mode of authoritarian governmentality and a mode of pragmatism that has been outlined by Chobing-Huat and other sociologists in thinking about the way Singapore manages its population. So that's the notion of pragmatism I have in mind. So the non-pragmatic approach would be it's not equal, but I guess the closest in proximity would be this particular word. It's a non-utilitarian, it's non-essential. So the frustration I had over COVID is that, everybody was up in arms over being labeled non-essential, and a desire for artists to be included and say, hey, I'm essential. But the value of art and artists itself is exactly in the fact that it's non-essential. Once it becomes utilitarian or, then it becomes propaganda. You get what I mean? So that would be a non-pragmatic presence in a way. And I see artistic practice as one of these non-pragmatic presence, but it's not only solely. As we have seen in art, it can be easily co-opted into the commodity form and the market. So it's also within artistic practice resisting this utility and this instrumentalization.
All right, so there are a couple of other questions that I think you might want to address, which is one from Teo Xiaoting, who asks what objects you're studying. Then we also have Eileen, who wants to find out more about how pragmatic resistance is connected to hope / optimism. Then we have Joanne Liao, who would like to ask you how you theorize the spatial implications of the production of private and public spaces in these gestures. How are these durational gestures altering or failing to alter the public spaces of public discourse or performance in Singapore? So let's take these three first. See how we go.
The conversation on objects, it's a long conversation and I'm still trying to pin it down. But what I can say for certain is that because of the nature of this investigation, it cannot be solidified and congealed into one object. It necessarily needs to be an object that speaks to other sites and other objects. So for example, a constellation of objects that I've assembled for each chapter or that I have in mind. So in this particular chapter on Lord Mountbatten Thinks of Pink, it will include Jason Wee's diptych photographs. It will include Fort Road as a site, as a reclaimed land, and I'm reading Joanne and Charmaine's paper on transnational sands and the politics of that. Also thinking about queer dispossession and ecological dispossession. This notion that Fort Road as a site can survive because it was land left to fallow after being reclaimed and therefore being appropriated by the queer community for a cruising site. So things like that. So thinking about constellations of different objects that allow for different modes of non-pragmatic presence to survive and to be momentarily visible, in a way. So I hope that answers. And other chapters will have other constellation of objects, but most importantly, I'm very, very much geared towards thinking about Singapore along a longer trajectory of time. So I'm thinking about theatre productions in the 1930s and the introduction of 377A in 1938. So, like thinking along that arc, that span of time. So there can be gestures of interpolative hills across time. Yeah. Joanne's question is fantastic. Honestly, that's something that I haven't given enough consideration to. I'm also thinking about this production of space in Singapore and what we always consider as a very binary kind of private-public space. Within the Singaporean condition, the public is always in the private and the private is always in the public. So there's this like Mobius strip kind of twist that goes on where there's always the interior within the exterior space and exterior within the interior space. So that's the theorization of space that I have at this point in time, where because of the hyper concentration and scarcity of land, it creates certain kind of pressures on queer presence and existence. where you are simultaneously both private and public at the same time. And there isn't this binary default between the periphery and the center, or the external and the internal. Yeah, it's also very delusion in a way, but I haven't got there yet. Yeah. Thank you. Is there a question I missed?
Well, so there are a couple more since we're doing good on time. Luke Matthew Tan asks, they're thinking about your 2016 queer project installation at the Institute of Contemporary Art. So in your mind, could you explain the thinking about how the work evolved? To the mind of Luke, right? It seems to be more visible and more non-pragmatic, right? As it directly contests the issue. So by insisting on putting black vinyl stickers on two objects in the installation rather than removing them entirely. Natalie Tai asks, there's tension as old as time, but the conditions of production / preservation of some of these non-pragmatic forms of resistance not inevitably hook into a homo-capitalist subjectivity. And last one for this round. So Chiming Wong asked, beyond strategies of resistance and questions of visibility, how will you discuss homophobia as institutionalized in Singapore? Are there strategies for dialogue and negotiation, and how have they failed?
Yeah, it's really, really big questions. I'm not sure within the 7 minutes I can get to all of them.
You can do it.
Okay, we've got regards to Luke's question on queer objects. I think the main difference, as you can see, the thing that was most interesting about the queer objects installation for me was the premise that in the beginning, before the censorship incident, that anybody could come in and remove some objects and replace it with their own objects. So it really is a contingent archive that keeps shifting over the duration of the exhibition itself, but that was foreclosed by the censorship issue itself. So for me, that was the most important and necessary aspect of the installation that was unfortunately not allowed to survive. And for me, that actually speaks to why I'm pursuing what I'm researching on now, and thinking about the archive as not something that is monolithic and settled and fixed, but is something that is constantly fluid or porous in a way to allow, shifts in shape over time. So that's how my thinking has evolved from back then to now. Yeah, because unfortunately, it reaches a threshold where you realize that no matter what kind of aesthetic exercise or product that you put out, as long as it enters the institutional frame, it gets, within Singapore, it gets truncated or it gets foreclosed or castrated in a way. Yeah, and there's a frustration with that. And that's why probably the pivot to theory and thinking about theorization and speculative kind of possibilities. Yeah, and I think this is the space. Of course, it's in dialogue with practice, but yeah, it helps to have this space to think. Okay, Natalie's question is excellent. And I've also been critiqued on why Jason Wee, why another gay male Chinese artist? And honestly, I haven't grappled with the entire selection of objects for my dissertation yet. And ideally, I would like it to have some mode of diversity that goes beyond tropes of diversity that is imposed by a liberal humanist framework. So it's not like the token, like one of this category, one of each category, but thinking about a certain kind of intersectional approach to these constellations, and the fact that they are contingent and always changing is also helpful. Yeah, but that's something that I have to be very, very aware of and careful, that in the production of theory, we are making these objects legible and visible. And once we make them legible and understandable and commodifiable, do they not fall into the trap of being captured? So as theorists, as people who are producing theory about objects, are we overmining, are we undermining these objects in the production of scholarship around? So that's something that needs to be negotiated with. And the way I circumvent that as a practitioner who has had a practice in the past and coming into theory is to be in constant dialogue with Jason, or the constant dialogue with the artist who is producing the work. So it's something that is a conversation instead of me doing a one-sided reading of the work itself. Yeah. I think that's should I take more questions or?
Well, we're at 10:57. If you can quickly, I suppose, in like 1 or 2 minutes, respond to Jason Wee, who's actually said there's something to be said about the language of the state, how often it smuggles into itself, sometimes misaligned, sometimes contradictory impulses and ideologies, camouflages intra-party struggles, and itself deliberately cautious, roundabout, almost secretive about what the country wants to ultimately arrive at with its queer citizens. Perhaps a form of resistance is to take this language and write it back against the grain in public spaces, to replay its secrecy as improvisation, as a dominant tune/tactic. It's a big thing, but can you deal with that in like a couple of minutes or so?
Yeah, I don't think that's a question. That's Jason Wee making a statement about his artwork and what it's trying to perform. So thank you. As I mentioned, this illustrates the point that I was mentioning. It's like it's a back and forth. It's a conversation between the producer of the work and also the like thinking and theorizing about it. So thank you, Jason. That's perfect. And I'm going to copy that and include that in my dissertation.
One last point. So the term pragmatic reifies the state's practices. In the first place, can the state's practices sometimes be incoherent and even excessive? Would you consider pragmatic versus non-pragmatic beyond a simple opposition?
Yeah. Yes, the state's practice might be incoherent in terms of its execution or uneven in terms of its implementation, but its pragmatism as its fundamental philosophy remains, I think, within Singapore quite consistent. As we have seen from the 1993 speech to the 2016 speech, is a mode of governance, it's a philosophy of governance that Wong Kan Seng passed on to Lawrence Wong. So the philosophy of pragmatism, I think, is consistent. And I do think we have to be very careful about falling into the trap of the binary opposition, and I agree. So Xingyu, thanks for pointing it out. And even the chart itself, now that when I look at it, it's also highly reductive. Once you put it into this mode, but it's just a model for us to think. Yeah, and ultimately when we produce or we continue to write about it, this model is going to shift and be inadequate. It would not be able to contain. And I think that's the intention, that we move past these binaries. Okay, it's 10:50.
Yes, it is. So I think why don't we turn over to Natalie just for a few moments for any concluding thoughts, and then Zihan, if you have a couple of things to say, and then we can end off.
All right. Yeah, thanks very much. No, I thought that was really the questions were really extraordinary, as were your answers. And this is a huge project that you're talking about, this idea of like, you're kind of at the sort of the distillation of so much queer, like what queer theory has been trying to do for so many decades now, is get to the non-pragmatic, get to the non-identitarian. And so I just really look forward to seeing where you're going to push with this. And I'm particularly interested in what you said about like looking at theater works back from the 1930s onwards, because I think that's there's so much to be mined. And like, if we move beyond this, like the liberal rights framework, and start to just really explore the creation of queer life worlds and what that looks like, and what we can look at from the past and what's been lost and can be recuperated as possible futures. So again, I just really look forward to seeing where you go with it.
All right, Zihan, any concluding thoughts?
Thank you so much for everybody who's here, and colleagues and friends. I've been doing remote learning for like 3 semesters, and it's incredibly isolating to be thinking alone at times. But this is very, very helpful in seeing people and hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zihan. Thank you everyone for being here. A video of this session, I think, will uploaded on Academia SG, and look out for our next session on, I believe, April 10th. For all of you who've taken your Saturday morning to be with us, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. Thank you all.